And what most people never realize is that the shift we're searching for in the mind often begins somewhere deeper, quieter, and far more powerful within the body. I've come to see the human heart not simply as a biological organ, but as a kind of intelligent center, one that continuously communicates with the brain, the nervous system, and even the chemistry of the body. This isn't poetic language, it's a measurable, observable process. Every beat carries electrical signals. Every rhythm sends information, and over time those signals begin to shape how we think, how we feel, and ultimately, how we live. When we experience emotions, we tend to assume they originate in the brain, but the reality is more layered than that. The heart generates its own patterns, coherent or chaotic, depending on our emotional state. And those patterns don't stay isolated. They travel upward, influencing brain activity, perception, and decision-making in ways we're only beginning to fully understand. I've noticed something fascinating in my own life. When I'm overwhelmed, frustrated, or anxious, my thinking becomes narrow. My options seem limited. But when I consciously shift into a state of appreciation or calm, something changes. My thoughts become clearer. Solutions appear where there were none before. It's almost as if the heart is opening a channel the brain alone couldn't access. This is where belief begins to take on a new meaning. We often think of belief as a mental act, something we choose or adopt intellectually. But belief is also something we feel. It's something we embody. When the heart and brain are aligned, belief becomes more than an idea. It becomes a signal, a consistent message that the body begins to trust and follow. And the body is always listening. Every cell responds to the signals it receives. Hormones shift. Neural pathways strengthen or weaken. Even the expression of our genes can change based on the emotional environment we create within ourselves. This means that our inner state is not just a reflection of our life, it's actively shaping it. Ancient traditions understood this in a symbolic way. They spoke of the heart as a center of knowing, a place where truth could be felt rather than analyzed. Today, modern science is beginning to echo that understanding, not through metaphor, but through data. We're seeing how emotional coherence, when the heart's rhythm becomes smooth and ordered, can influence cognitive performance, resilience, and even physical health. But here's the part that changes everything. This coherence isn't something reserved for rare moments or special conditions. It's something we can create intentionally. I've practiced this in simple ways. Slowing down my breathing, bringing my attention to the area around the heart, recalling a genuine feeling of gratitude, not forced, not imagined, but remembered. Within moments, there's a shift. The body softens, the mind quiets. And a different kind of awareness begins to emerge. It's subtle at first, easy to overlook, but with repetition, it becomes familiar, reliable. Almost like tuning an instrument that was always there, just slightly out of alignment. And once we experience that alignment, we begin to notice how often we live without it. We move through our days reacting, rushing, thinking our way through problems that aren't purely mental. We try to change our lives by changing our thoughts while ignoring the emotional patterns that keep pulling us back into the same states. The heart offers another path, not by replacing the mind, but by partnering with it. When the heart signals become steady and coherent, the brain begins to follow. Stress responses decrease, creativity increases, we become less reactive and more responsive. And in that space, new choices become possible. I've seen how this affects the way we relate to others as well. When we're internally coherent, our presence changes. People feel it, even if they can't explain it. Conversations become more open, conflicts soften. There's a sense of connection that doesn't require effort. It simply arises. This suggests something profound about human consciousness. We are not isolated systems. We are deeply interconnected, not just socially, but energetically and biologically. The signals we generate within ourselves don't stop at the boundaries of our bodies. They influence the environment around us in subtle but meaningful ways. And if that's true, then the state of our heart isn't just a personal experience, it's a contribution. Every moment of coherence, every genuine feeling of appreciation or compassion is shaping more than our internal chemistry. It's participating in a larger field of human experience. And while that idea may seem abstract, its effects are anything but. Think about the environments you've been in, the rooms where tension was thick, even without words, and the spaces where you felt at ease, supported, understood. Those differences aren't accidental, they're created by the collective states of the people within them. So when we begin to work with the heart intentionally, we're not just improving our own well-being, we're influencing the quality of the spaces we move through, the interactions we have, and the outcomes we experience. But this requires a shift in how we see ourselves. We have to move beyond the idea that we are passive observers of our lives, reacting to external circumstances. Instead, we begin to recognize that we are active participants, constantly shaping our reality through the signals we generate, both mentally and emotionally. This doesn't mean ignoring challenges or pretending everything is positive. It means meeting those challenges from a different state of being, a state where the heart is not overwhelmed, but steady, not closed, but engaged. From that state, even difficult situations begin to look different. We respond with clarity instead of confusion, with intention instead of impulse. And over time, those small shifts in response begin to create larger shifts in direction. This is the power that was never formally taught, not because it was hidden, but because it was overlooked. It doesn't require complex technology or specialized knowledge. It requires awareness, practice, and a willingness to explore the space within ourselves that we've been conditioned to ignore. And as we continue to explore that space, something unexpected begins to happen. The boundary between thought and feeling starts to dissolve. The separation between mind and body becomes less defined. And we begin to experience ourselves not as fragmented parts, but as a unified system, one where the heart plays a central role in guiding not just how we feel, but how we perceive, how we choose, and how we create the reality we live in. And once that realization begins to take root, it naturally leads us to question something even deeper. Because if the heart is influencing how we perceive reality, then we have to ask a deeper question. Are we seeing the world as it truly is, or as our internal state allows us to see it? I've reflected on this often. Two people can walk through the same experience and come away with completely different interpretations. One sees opportunity, the other sees limitation. One feels supported, the other feels threatened. The external conditions may be identical, yet the internal response creates entirely different realities. This is where the heart's role becomes even more significant. The signals generated by the heart don't just affect how we feel, they shape the filters through which we interpret the world. When the heart is in a state of coherence, the brain receives stable, rhythmic information. This stability allows for clearer processing, more balanced judgment, and a broader awareness of possibilities. But when the heart is in a state of stress or irregularity, those signals become erratic, and the brain mirrors that chaos in its perceptions. I've noticed that in moments of emotional turbulence, it's not just my feelings that become unstable, it's my entire sense of reality. Small challenges appear overwhelming. Neutral situations feel negative. It's as if the lens through which I'm viewing life has been distorted. And yet when I return to a calm, centered state, the same circumstances often reveal a completely different set of options. So the question isn't just what is happening, but from what state am I perceiving what is happening? This shift in perspective is subtle, but it changes everything. Because once we understand that perception is influenced by our internal state, we begin to reclaim a level of agency we may not have realized we had. We're no longer entirely at the mercy of external events. Instead, we can influence how those events are experienced and therefore how we respond to them. And response is where transformation begins. Most of us are conditioned to react automatically. A situation triggers an emotion, and that emotion drives a behavior. It happens so quickly that it feels unavoidable. But when we introduce awareness of the heart's role, we create a space between stimulus and response. In that space, there is choice. I've practiced pausing in that space, even if only for a few seconds. Bringing attention back to the heart, breathing slowly, allowing the initial surge of emotion to settle. What I've found is that the intensity of the reaction often fades, and in its place, a more grounded response becomes available. It doesn't mean the situation changes, it means I change how I meet it. And over time, those moments of conscious response begin to accumulate. They form new patterns, new habits, new ways of being that gradually replace the old automatic reactions. This is where belief and biology begin to merge in a very real way. Every time we choose a coherent emotional state over a reactive one, we're reinforcing new neural pathways. We're teaching the body a different baseline. And as that baseline shifts, what once felt difficult becomes natural. But there's another layer to this that's often overlooked. The heart doesn't just respond to what is, it also responds to what we focus on. Our attention acts like a signal amplifier. Whatever we consistently bring into our awareness begins to shape our internal state, which in turn influences the heart's rhythm and the brain's interpretation. If our attention is constantly drawn to stress, conflict, or fear, the heart reflects that pattern. But if we intentionally direct our focus toward moments of appreciation, connection, or possibility, the heart begins to organize itself differently. I've found that this doesn't require ignoring reality, it requires expanding it. Even in challenging situations, there are always multiple aspects we could focus on. The difficulty is real, but so is the opportunity to learn, adapt, or grow. When we choose to include those aspects in our awareness, we're not denying the challenge, we're changing our relationship to it. And that relationship determines our experience. This is why two people can face the same obstacle and emerge with completely different outcomes. It's not just about skill or knowledge, it's about the internal state from which they engage with the situation. The heart, in this sense, becomes a kind of compass. Not one that tells us what to think, but one that influences how clearly we can think. When it's aligned and coherent, we navigate life with a sense of direction that feels intuitive, almost effortless. Decisions come with a sense of clarity. Actions feel more precise. There's less second guessing, less internal conflict. But when that coherence is absent, everything feels more complicated. We overanalyze, we hesitate, we doubt ourselves, and often we attribute that confusion to external uncertainty, when in reality it's a reflection of internal misalignment. I've come to see that many of the answers we search for externally are actually dependent on conditions we create internally. Clarity isn't something we find, it's something that emerges when the system is in balance. And the heart plays a central role in creating that balance. This doesn't mean the mind becomes less important. In fact, the mind becomes more effective when it's supported by a coherent heart. Logic and intuition begin to work together instead of competing. Analysis becomes sharper but also more flexible. We're able to consider multiple perspectives without becoming overwhelmed by them. This integration is where a deeper level of intelligence begins to unfold. Not just intellectual intelligence, but a kind of embodied awareness that draws from both thought and feeling. It's the ability to sense what is appropriate in a given moment, beyond just what is logical or expected. And this is where the conversation begins to extend beyond the individual. Because if each of us is generating signals that influence our perception, our behavior, and even the environment around us, then what happens when groups of people begin to cultivate coherence intentionally? What happens when teams, communities, or even larger populations start operating from a more aligned internal state? We've already seen glimpses of this in smaller settings, moments where a shared sense of purpose or connection creates outcomes that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. There's a kind of synergy that emerges where the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts. If that principle scales, then the implications are significant. It suggests that the way we manage our internal state isn't just a personal practice, it's a collective influence. And that leads us into a territory that challenges many of our assumptions about how change happens. We tend to think of change as something driven by external action, policy, systems, structures. And while those are important, they're often shaped by the individuals who create and operate within them. If those individuals are operating from stress, fear, or disconnection, those qualities inevitably become embedded in what they create. But if they're operating from coherence, clarity, and a sense of connection, something very different begins to emerge. So the question becomes not just what do we need to change out there, but what state are we bringing into what we're creating? And as we begin to explore that question more deeply, we start to recognize that the power of the heart isn't limited to personal transformation. It may be one of the most overlooked factors in how we shape the world around us. And if that's the case, then understanding how to access, stabilize, and sustain that coherence becomes more than just a personal skill. It becomes a responsibility that we're only just beginning to understand, because the moment we begin to see this as a responsibility, everything about how we approach our inner world starts to change. I've realized that most of us were never taught to take ownership of our internal state in a practical way. We were taught to manage behavior, to control actions, to think logically, but not to consciously regulate the emotional signals that drive those actions in the first place. And yet, those signals are constantly shaping the outcomes we experience. So the question becomes, how do we stabilize something that feels so automatic? The answer, I've found, begins with awareness, but it doesn't end there. Awareness allows us to notice when we're out of alignment. It brings unconscious patterns into view. But awareness alone doesn't necessarily change those patterns. What changes them is consistent, intentional practice, small, repeatable actions that gradually teach the body a new way of being. I started by observing the moments when my state shifted without my permission. A conversation, a piece of news, an unexpected challenge. Something would trigger a reaction, and before I knew it, my entire internal landscape had changed. My breathing would become shallow. My thoughts would accelerate. My body would tighten. In the past, I would have tried to think my way out of that state, but what I've learned is that the body doesn't respond to logic in those moments. It responds to signals. So instead of forcing a new thought, I began changing the signal, slowing the breath, softening the chest, bringing attention gently to the heart area, not with intensity, but with curiosity. And then introducing a feeling, not a dramatic one, but something simple and real. Appreciation for a small moment, gratitude for something specific, even a memory that carried a sense of warmth. At first, it felt almost too subtle to matter. But the body noticed. Within a short time, the rhythm of the heart began to change. The tension in the body eased, and the mind, which had been racing just moments before, began to settle on its own. That's when I understood something important. The heart doesn't require force. It responds to consistency. It's not about creating a perfect state instantly. It's about gently guiding the system again and again until coherence becomes familiar. And familiarity is what eventually turns practice into habit. Once that habit begins to form, something shifts in how we experience everyday life. Situations that used to trigger strong reactions start to lose their intensity, not because they've become less significant, but because our internal response has changed. We begin to feel a sense of space where there used to be pressure, and in that space, new possibilities emerge. I've noticed that creativity often arises in these moments. Solutions that weren't visible before seem to appear naturally. It's not that we're trying harder, it's that we're no longer blocking the flow of information with internal noise. This suggests that the heart isn't just regulating emotion, it's influencing access to insight. When the system is coherent, we're more receptive, more attuned, more capable of recognizing patterns and connections that would otherwise go unnoticed. And this has practical implications in every area of life. In decision-making, it allows us to move beyond analysis paralysis. We still consider information, but we're not overwhelmed by it. There's a sense of inner alignment that helps guide the choice. In relationships, it changes the quality of our interactions. We listen more deeply. We respond more thoughtfully. We're less driven by the need to defend or prove, and more open to understanding. In personal growth, it creates a stable foundation. Instead of constantly trying to fix ourselves, we begin to work with ourselves, recognizing that change is not about becoming someone else, but about aligning more fully with who we already are, beneath the noise. But there's another aspect of this that's easy to overlook. Consistency doesn't mean perfection. There will still be moments when we fall out of coherence, times when stress takes over, when emotions feel overwhelming, when old patterns resurface. That's part of the process. What matters is not avoiding those moments, but how quickly we return. Each time we come back to a coherent state, we reinforce the pathway. We remind the body of what balance feels like. And over time, that return becomes faster, more natural, almost automatic. I've come to see it like strengthening a muscle. At first, it requires effort and attention. But with repetition, it becomes part of our baseline, something we can access without thinking, even in the middle of challenging situations. And when that happens, the way we move through the world begins to change in subtle but powerful ways. We become less reactive to external noise. less dependent on circumstances for our sense of stability, more anchored in a state that we can generate from within. This doesn't disconnect us from reality, it connects us more deeply to it. Because when we're not overwhelmed by internal fluctuations, we can engage more fully with what's actually happening. We're present, aware, responsive. And that presence has an effect. People notice it, not necessarily in a conscious way, but in how they feel around us. There's a difference between interacting with someone who is internally scattered and someone who is grounded and coherent. That difference influences trust, communication, and even collaboration. So in a very real sense, the work we do within ourselves extends outward into every interaction we have. It shapes the tone of conversations, the direction of decisions, the quality of the environments we participate in. And this is where the idea of responsibility becomes something tangible, not as a burden, but as an opportunity. An opportunity to contribute to the world not just through what we do, but through how we are. Because every moment we spend in coherence is a moment where we're adding stability, clarity, and balance to the field around us. And while that may seem like a small contribution on the surface, its effects can ripple outward in ways we may never fully see. I've often wondered how different our collective experience would be if more people understood this, not just intellectually, but through direct practice. If coherence became as common as stress, if awareness of the heart's influence was integrated into how we approach challenges, relationships, and decisions, it wouldn't eliminate difficulty, but it would change how we meet it. And that change, multiplied across individuals, could begin to shift patterns on a much larger scale. Which brings us to an even deeper consideration. If the heart is capable of influencing not only our internal state, but also our perception, our behavior, and the environments we help create, then what else might be possible when we begin to explore its potential more fully? What capacities remain untapped simply because we haven't been shown how to access them? What aspects of human experience are waiting just beyond the edge of our current awareness? And as we continue to practice, to refine our ability to enter and sustain coherence, we may begin to notice subtle changes that go beyond emotional balance or mental clarity. Changes that hint at a deeper connection, one that doesn't rely on words, yet communicates with remarkable precision. And it's right at the edge of that realization, just before it becomes something we can fully describe, that we start to sense there is still so much more to uncover. And the deeper we move into that space, the more we begin to realize that what we once considered subtle may actually be foundational. I've found that when the heart is consistently in a coherent state, there's a quiet shift in sensitivity, not emotional fragility, but a refined awareness. It's as if the noise that once filled the background begins to fade, and in its place, a more precise signal becomes detectable. At first, this can feel unfamiliar. We're used to strong, obvious reactions, clear signals that demand our attention. But this is different. It's quieter, more nuanced, a kind of internal guidance that doesn't push or force, but gently indicates. And the challenge here is trust, because this form of awareness doesn't always align with our previchney patterns of decision-making. It doesn't argue or justify. It doesn't present long chains of logic. Instead, it shows up as a sense, a subtle knowing that something is aligned or not. I've learned not to dismiss that signal. There have been moments when everything looked correct on the surface, when logic supported a certain choice, and yet something within felt slightly off. In the past, I would have ignored that feeling, assuming it was uncertainty or hesitation. But over time, I began to recognize that this quiet signal often carried information the analytical mind hadn't yet processed. And when I followed it, even without fully understanding why, the outcomes tended to align more closely with what truly mattered. This doesn't mean abandoning reason. It means expanding the way we define intelligence. We begin to include not just what we can analyze, but what we can sense, not just what we can prove, but what we can perceive through direct experience. The heart becomes part of an integrated system of awareness working alongside the mind rather than beneath it. And as this integration deepens, another shift begins to occur. Our relationship with time starts to feel different. When we're reactive, caught in cycles of stress or anticipation, Time often feels compressed. We rush, we feel behind, there's a constant pressure to catch up or stay ahead. But in a coherent state, that pressure eases. There's a sense of presence that expands the moment, allowing us to engage more fully with what's in front of us. This doesn't slow time itself, it changes our experience of it. And in that expanded experience, we begin to notice details we would have otherwise missed, opportunities that were always there but hidden beneath distraction, subtle shifts in conversations, small cues in our environment that guide our actions in more effective ways. It's almost as if coherence enhances our ability to synchronize with the flow of events. We're not forcing outcomes, we're aligning with them. I've noticed this particularly in moments of creative work or problem solving. When I approach a challenge from a state of tension, progress feels difficult. Ideas come slowly, if at all. But when I shift into coherence first, before trying to solve anything, the process becomes smoother. Connections form naturally. Solutions arise with less effort. It raises an interesting possibility. What if the heart is not just regulating our internal state, but also influencing how we interact with patterns that exist beyond our immediate awareness? Patterns in systems, in relationships, in the unfolding of events themselves. We often think of insight as something we generate internally, but what if in some cases it's something we're tuning into, something that becomes accessible when our internal state is ordered enough to receive it? This perspective doesn't require us to assume anything mystical. It simply invites us to consider that our current understanding of perception may be incomplete, that the boundaries between internal and external experience might be more fluid than we've been taught. And if that's true, then coherence becomes more than a personal benefit. It becomes a way of interacting with reality at a deeper level. I've experienced moments where this interaction feels almost effortless. Situations where the right conversation happens at the right time, where decisions lead to outcomes that feel aligned beyond what planning alone could achieve, where there's a sense of flow that carries things forward without resistance. It's not constant, but it's noticeable enough to recognize a pattern, and that pattern seems to emerge most clearly when the internal state is stable, open, and coherent. This brings us to another important realization. Control is not the same as alignment. We've been conditioned to believe that the more we control, the more secure our outcomes will be. But control often comes from a place of tension, of trying to force reality into a specific shape. Alignment, on the other hand, comes from coherence, from working with the natural flow of systems rather than against them. And the heart appears to play a key role in that alignment, not by dictating outcomes, but by helping us recognize which directions feel consistent with our deeper state and which do not. As we become more familiar with this process, we start to rely less on external validation. We still gather information, we still consider feedback, but we're not dependent on it in the same way. There's an internal reference point that provides stability even when external conditions are uncertain. This doesn't isolate us, it grounds us. It allows us to engage with complexity without becoming overwhelmed by it. And in a world where information is constant and often conflicting, that kind of grounding becomes incredibly valuable. But there's still another layer to explore. Because as coherence becomes more stable, the distinction between effort and ease begins to shift. We're taught that meaningful progress requires struggle, that effort must be intense to be effective. But coherence introduces a different dynamic. It shows us that there is a form of effort that is focused but not forced, engaged but not strained. In this state, action becomes more precise. We do less, but accomplish more. Not because we're avoiding work, but because we're no longer wasting energy on internal resistance. The system is aligned, and that alignment allows energy to move more efficiently toward a given outcome. I've seen how this changes not just what we do, but how we feel while doing it. There's less exhaustion, less frustration, more clarity and consistency. And over time, that changes our relationship with growth itself. It no longer feels like something we have to chase or struggle toward. It becomes something that unfolds naturally as we continue to refine our internal state. Which leads to a question that sits just beneath the surface of all of this. If coherence allows us to access deeper levels of awareness, to interact with reality more effectively, and to move through life with greater clarity and alignment, then why isn't this understanding more widely integrated into how we learn, how we work, how we develop as individuals? What would it look like if these principles were introduced early, practiced consistently, and understood not as abstract ideas, but as practical skills? How different would our decisions be? Our relationships, our collective direction, and perhaps even more importantly, what begins to awaken within us when the heart is no longer operating in the background, unnoticed and underutilized, but is brought forward as an active guiding force in how we think, how we feel, and how we engage with the world. Because when the heart moves from the background into an active role, something profound begins to reorganize within us. I've noticed that it doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, layer by layer. The patterns we've relied on for years begin to shift, not because we're forcing them to, but because they no longer feel necessary in the same way. Reactions that once felt automatic start to lose their grip. The need to control every outcome begins to soften, and in its place there's a growing sense of trust, not blind trust, but a grounded confidence that comes from direct experience. The more we return to coherence, the more we see its effects, and the more natural it becomes to rely on it. This is where a deeper form of stability begins to emerge. Not the kind that depends on everything going according to plan, but the kind that remains steady even when circumstances are uncertain. It's a stability rooted in our internal state, not in external conditions. And that changes how we relate to uncertainty itself. Instead of seeing it as something to avoid, we begin to recognize it as a space of possibility, a space where outcomes haven't yet been defined, where new directions can still emerge. When we're coherent, we're able to stand in that space without immediately trying to fill it with assumptions or fears. We become more comfortable with not knowing. And in that comfort, something interesting happens. Our attention sharpens. We start to notice subtle cues that guide us forward, small pieces of information that, when combined, create a clearer picture of what's unfolding. It's not about predicting the future, it's about being present enough to respond effectively as it reveals itself. I've experienced this in moments where decisions needed to be made without complete information. In the past, that would have created tension, a need to rush, to decide quickly just to relieve the discomfort. But with a coherent state, the urgency fades. There's space to observe, to wait for the right moment to act. And often, that moment becomes obvious, not because it announces itself loudly, but because everything aligns in a way that feels unmistakable. This alignment isn't something we can force. It's something we allow. And allowing requires a different kind of discipline, one that isn't about pushing harder, but about staying present, staying aware, and staying connected to the internal signals that guide us. This brings us back to the idea of practice. Because without consistent practice, it's easy to fall back into old patterns. The world around us is constantly pulling for our attention, often in ways that disrupt coherence. Fast-paced environments, constant stimulation, emotional triggers, they all compete for our internal balance. So maintaining coherence becomes an active process, not something we do once, but something we return to throughout the day. I've found that even brief moments of recalibration can make a significant difference. A few slow breaths, a shift in attention, a conscious choice to move from tension to appreciation, even if only slightly. These small adjustments accumulate. They create a baseline that becomes more stable over time. And as that baseline stabilizes, we begin to carry coherence with us into situations that once disrupted it. Conversations that used to trigger stress become more manageable. Challenges that once felt overwhelming become opportunities to apply what we've practiced. This is where the real integration happens. Not in isolated moments of calm, but in the middle of real life. When coherence is present during difficulty, it reveals its true value. Because it's easy to feel balanced when everything is going well. The real measure is how we respond when it isn't. And in those moments, the heart becomes a kind of anchor, a steady point we can return to, regardless of what's happening externally. I've come to see that this anchor is always available. It doesn't disappear when we lose awareness of it. It simply waits for us to return. And every time we do return, we strengthen that connection. Over time, this begins to change our identity. We no longer see ourselves as someone who is easily thrown off balance. Instead, we begin to recognize ourselves as someone who can navigate complexity without losing alignment. This shift in identity is subtle but powerful because the way we see ourselves influences the way we act, and the way we act reinforces the way we see ourselves. So as coherence becomes part of our identity, it begins to shape our choices in ways that feel natural rather than forced. We choose responses that align with stability. We move away from patterns that create unnecessary stress. We become more intentional, not because we have to be, but because it feels consistent with who we are becoming. And this consistency creates momentum, a kind of forward movement that doesn't rely on bursts of motivation, but on a steady alignment with our internal state. This is where growth becomes sustainable, not dependent on external pressure or temporary inspiration, but rooted in a daily practice that continues regardless of circumstances. And as this growth continues, we begin to notice something else. Our sense of separation starts to diminish. The boundary between inner and outer experience becomes less rigid. We start to see how our internal state influences what we notice, how we interpret it, and how we respond. The world doesn't feel like something happening to us. It feels like something we're participating in. This participation brings a different level of engagement. We're not just reacting to life, we're interacting with it. And that interaction is shaped by the quality of the signals we generate from within. So the heart, in this sense, becomes more than just a center of coherence. It becomes a point of connection, a place where internal awareness meets external experience. And as that connection deepens, we begin to sense that our influence may extend further than we once believed. Not in a dramatic or exaggerated way, but in subtle, consistent ways that shape the direction of our lives over time. And if we follow that idea just a little further, it leads us to a realization that feels both simple and expansive at the same time. That the power we've been searching for, the clarity, the stability, the sense of alignment, is not something we need to acquire from outside ourselves. It's something we learn to access, to stabilize, to trust, and to express through the way we live moment by moment. But even as that realization begins to settle in, there's still a deeper layer waiting just beneath it, a layer that asks us not only to understand this connection, but to explore what happens when we begin to rely on it in ways that go beyond what we previously thought possible. Because relying on this connection requires something more than understanding. It requires a shift in how we relate to ourselves at the most fundamental level. I've found that as we begin to trust the intelligence of the heart, we naturally start to question the patterns we've inherited, not just habits of behavior, but habits of perception, ways of interpreting the world that we've accepted without ever truly examining. Many of these patterns were formed in moments when coherence was absent, moments of stress, confusion, or emotional intensity. And over time, those moments shaped beliefs about what is safe, what is possible, what we are capable of. The body remembers those patterns. It repeats them, often without our awareness, reinforcing a version of reality that may no longer be accurate. This is where the heart becomes a gateway to change. Because when we enter a coherent state, we're not just calming the body, we're creating conditions where those patterns can be seen more clearly. We begin to notice the automatic thoughts that arise, the emotional responses that seem disproportionate, the subtle assumptions that influence our choices. And instead of reacting to them, we can observe them. That observation creates distance. And in that distance, there is freedom. Freedom to choose a different response. Freedom to question whether a belief is still relevant. Freedom to introduce a new signal, one that aligns more closely with who we are now, rather than who we were when the pattern was formed. I've experienced this in moments where a familiar reaction begins to surface, a sense of doubt, hesitation, or resistance. In the past, I would have followed that pattern automatically, but with awareness and coherence, I can pause and ask a different question. Is this response coming from my present state, or from a past condition that no longer applies? That question alone can shift everything, because it brings the pattern into conscious awareness. And once something is conscious, it can be changed. But change doesn't happen through force. It happens through repetition of a new experience. Each time we choose a coherent state in the presence of an old pattern, we're introducing new information into the system. We're showing the body that a different response is possible. And over time, that new response begins to feel more natural than the old one. This is how belief evolves, not through intellectual agreement, but through lived experience. We begin to believe in our capacity for stability because we've experienced it repeatedly. We begin to trust our ability to navigate uncertainty because we've done it from a coherent state. And that trust becomes a foundation that supports us as we explore deeper levels of awareness. Because as we move further into this process, we start to encounter aspects of ourselves that are less familiar, subtler layers of thought, quieter emotional patterns, underlying tendencies that influence our behavior in ways we hadn't previously noticed. This can feel uncomfortable at times, not because there's something wrong, but because we're seeing more clearly. And clarity often reveals things we've been avoiding. But the heart provides a stable environment for that exploration. It allows us to observe without becoming overwhelmed, to recognize patterns without identifying with them, to engage with our inner world in a way that is both honest and supportive. I've come to see this as a form of internal alignment, where different aspects of ourselves, the analytical mind, the emotional body, the intuitive sense, begin to communicate more effectively. There's less internal conflict, less contradiction, more coherence across the system as a whole. And that coherence creates a sense of integrity, not just in the moral sense, but in the structural sense. We feel more whole, more consistent, more aligned with the direction we're moving. This alignment doesn't eliminate challenges, but it changes how we experience them. Instead of feeling like obstacles, challenges begin to feel like points of interaction, places where we can apply what we've learned, where we can refine our ability to remain coherent under pressure. And each time we do that, we strengthen the system. We increase our capacity to maintain alignment in increasingly complex situations. This is where growth becomes exponential, not in a dramatic, sudden way, but in a steady expansion of capability. We're able to handle more without losing balance, to engage more deeply without becoming overwhelmed, to navigate uncertainty with a sense of clarity that wasn't available before. And as this capacity grows, something else begins to shift. Our sense of purpose becomes clearer, not as a fixed goal or destination, but as a direction, a way of engaging with life that feels meaningful and consistent with our internal state. We begin to recognize which activities, environments, and relationships support coherence, and which ones disrupt it. And naturally, we start to move toward what supports alignment, not out of obligation, but out of resonance. This creates a feedback loop. The more we align with coherence, the more our external life reflects that alignment. And the more our external life reflects it, the easier it becomes to maintain internally. But even within this alignment, there is still complexity. There are still decisions to be made, still uncertainties to navigate. Still moments where the path forward isn't immediately clear. And this is where reliance on the heart becomes essential. Not as a replacement for thinking, but as a stabilizing force that allows thinking to function at its best. When we're grounded in coherence, we can engage with complexity without becoming lost in it. We can hold multiple possibilities without needing immediate resolution. We can move forward with clarity, even when not all variables are known. This is a different way of operating, one that doesn't depend on complete control, but on consistent alignment. And as we continue to explore this way of being, we begin to sense that the potential of the heart may extend even further than we've experienced so far. That there may be levels of connection, perception, and influence that are still unfolding, waiting to be accessed as our capacity for coherence deepens. And it's right at this edge where understanding meets direct experience, where practice becomes embodiment, that we begin to realize we are only just beginning to discover what the heart is truly capable of